Hey everyone, welcome to another episode. And today's guest is no other than Emil. He's one of my mentor, really cool guy. And he ran some crazy campaign when it comes to like targeting and data and things like that in the past. First of all, it's a pleasure to have you here, Emil.
Thank you so much.
How about you give it a bit of introduction about yourself?
Yeah, for sure. So I am working as a growth consultant for an agency called Finest GC, and alongside that, I'm also coaching a number, I think, 200 plus outbound agencies at this point.
Thank you for that bit of introduction. Now, Emil here again, once again, like when it comes to copywriting, I think he's one of the people I look up to when it comes to like defining the targeting because that's one of the most important thing when it comes to actually cold email in general, right? So, Emil, talk to us a little bit about like A/B testing and like why is this such a big deal? Like, why do we have to do it?
Well, firstly, thanks for the nice words. A B testing is one of those things that is not just a necessity, it's essentially our entire business because something can look really good on paper. We can have the whole thesis behind it, why this would work and why the
Mm,
audience would resonate with something, but we just don't actually know until we run it. And it's something that
mm,
we see a lot with clients. They will base what we should say in outbound on what their prospects say that comes from inbound, which is entirely different. Like we have so little real estate when it comes to an outbound email,
mm,
where we have to have value proposition, we have to speak into their page. We also don't. We shouldn't be too salesy, and it's just all of
mm,
these things condensed into a very short message. It's hard for us to know
mm,
what would work and what won't work. So
mm.
we're much better off by doing a bunch of upfront work with setting up a number of tests because the good thing, the flip side of it is typically we don't need more than one winning angle from all of
Yeah.
those. And then we can just repeatedly run that angle.
Yeah, yeah. And like for the past like sort of interviews, we talk a lot about A/B testing when it comes to copywriting and things like that. But let's say when it comes to lead list building, how do you actually go about A/B testing that?
Yeah, so it's very like anything list building is very case by case thing. It depends. Like if you have one very
Mm,
clear ICP, then of course that's the one we're building around. But if it could be relevant for other industries and other verticals, then of course you have more options. And so usually the way we go about that is for example, we have a client right now that is essentially preventing chargebacks for other companies, and that could be relevant for a range of different verticals. We know SaaS
mm,
is one of them, so we just said, okay, we'll reach out to SaaS companies. But actually, it's not SaaS is not really a relevant ICP. It is
mm,
low ticket SaaS companies with a trial plan for a limited period, like
mm,
7 or 14 days, where you have to put your credit card because that's where chargebacks will happen. You sign up for something, you put your credit card, and you forget to cancel it. Like there's really two things for that. One is like what is really like the core audience that your offer is actually relevant for, like who is the offer most relevant for. And second to that is what kind of situation are they in. Like someone could on paper be an ICP for your service or product, but if it's not the right time for them, then it just won't really matter, right? If it's a matter of helping companies move into new locations and they just open a bunch of new locations, it's probably not relevant, right? Even though they on
mm,
paper might be a good fit. So
mm,
it's kind of this balance between like getting really specific with the ICP, but also at the same
mm.
time what situation they're in.
Gotcha, gotcha. I mean, that's some good advice. Now when it comes to like segmenting your lead list, right? Because that's one of the like ongoing conversation in the community. What are the typically, I guess, like variables that you look into? Maybe it's company size, persona, something else. I know you talked a little bit about that, like in the previous question, but maybe you can expand more on that for the audience.
Yeah, it sort of ties in with the other thing of like what situation they're in. So when we start working with a new client, we have sort of like we call it like the surface level ICP. So anything that you can put a filter on, employee size, location,
Mm,
and stuff like that. Anything that you can find as a filter on any database. And then secondary to that, once we go a little deeper, is the ICS, the ideal customer situation. So that could be a company raised their B series round within the last 6 months. It could be that
mm,
a certain permit were filed within a certain time frame, whatever it may be that is publicly scrapable on the internet. Then we can
mm.
look for that as a trigger.
I love that. IDCS. I've never heard of that. Sorry, ICPS. I've never heard of that before.
No,
That's really interesting.
just ICS, ideal customer situation.
Ideal customer situation. Oh, interesting, interesting. I have to look more into that. So now when it comes to like selling to different stuff like company size, let's say local leadless company within 1 or 10 people and enterprises and things like that. What have you seen like the differences between just like different company size and like how should you go about like approaching those decision makers?
So I think the size of the companies and the decision makers are like two separate things. There's for sure a difference between reaching out to like a local business owner versus like a CEO of
Mhm.
an enterprise company or something like that.
Mm,
Just on a company level, they will have been exposed to so like the enterprise person would have been exposed to so much more cold email,
mm,
so much more like hard selling and pitch slapping than the local person. And there's just things that a local business owner is not as much aware of as we can assume an enterprise level person would be.
mm,
Even more when it comes to the specific job titles. Like if we're targeting CMOs and CEOs, like there is assumptions we can make about what they care about. For example, we can assume that the CMO would probably resonate better with certain marketing metrics like CPA and whatnot, whereas the
mm.
CEO is generally very focused on the bottom line. So that's what we're going to speak into.
Yeah, I mean, like I've seen that in my own campaigns as well. Like selling to, I guess, like enterprises, usually you get a lot less like responses, right, from
Mm.
just decision maker in general. For those who are actually reaching out to or like selling their product to enterprises, do you have any like tips and I guess like tricks for them to like get to the actual decision maker to buy the product?
I mean, the way you get to them is kind of the same. Like if it's a local business or an enterprise company, but I think a mindset shift I had at one point is that you're not actually reaching out to the an enterprise company. You're reaching out to John, who works at an enterprise company, who is also
Mm,
just a person, which is something we all have in common. So there are for sure like still psychological things that you can speak into. Like if you know that it's a very prominent company that you can assume just gets hard rammed with emails every day, then maybe being a little more lighthearted, a little more playful,
mm,
like very low friction might be more beneficial because it's just a pattern interrupt. That's something we want to think about all the time. Is like, are we saying the exact same thing everyone else is saying? Then we probably should say something
mm.
else. If everyone's six, we sack.
No, I mean, I love that. I talk to a lot of people, and then like I think the misconception here is, look, you're selling to CEO of like 7, 8 figures company, so you have to keep it professional, But no, I mean, like you're completely right. At the end of the day, they are just a person that you're
Yeah.
talking to, right? You're selling to another person, so 100% with you on that. Now, let's go back a little bit about the importance of like A/B testing of like I guess like different targeting and personas and things like that. So, do you have one example for the audience where the same exact copy flop for one lead list, but crush for another?
Yeah, that would actually be the same example as I brought up in the beginning. That's the first one that comes to mind, at least, where we had like a very broad SaaS campaign for this chargeback product where it just flopped. Like, by far, most of the replies were just, this is not applicable to us. Like, it just doesn't make sense. But there was a singular negative reply that mentioned that you don't have to put a credit card with their trial, so they don't get any chargebacks, meaning they literally just told us the exact ICP we should be targeting. So we ran the exact
Mm,
same thing, more or less the exact same thing, right, to the new audience, and it performed significantly better just because we were talking to the right people.
no, I mean that's great. A lot of people want to think of like A/B testing. It's like, hey, let me just write different copy. Let
Mm,
me just like optimize like these small things that don't matter. But I mean, like that's one prime example, right? Like
yeah,
targeting actually does matter too. Sometimes you could use the same copy just to redefine your ICP, and then that all of a sudden it just works. You don't even have to write new copies. So yeah, thank you for walking us through that example. Now let's talk a bit about just like verification tools, right? Because one question that people have is like, number one, why do we even need to verify a lead list? So let's say you got an email from a parlor, why do you even need to do that?
well, so as with any email, like if they can get outdated, people can get fired from their job, they can quit, they can stop working there for any reason, then the email is no longer valid. Like we don't gain anything from sending it to it, and if the email is no longer active, that's when we will see a bounce, which is going to negatively impact our deliverability.
Mm.
So it is by all means a necessity to validate the emails.
Cool, cool. Okay, so I mean, like, what's your thought on like double verification then? Because some people they might ask, like, oh, if you're using some tool like Million Verifiers, why do you have to go through another tool? Let's say like Bounce Band, for example. Like, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, double validation is obviously never a bad idea. We don't really double validate in our process, but it kind of happens on its own because we use so many email enrichment tools, and a lot of them will have native validation integration inside of it.
Mm,
So, like, let's say we try one tool to find an email, and then we try a second one and a third one. Then with all the emails we're left with, we will run one validation tool on that. Specifically, find email these days, we're seeing extremely good
mm,
results with. These days, consistently kept us under a 2% bounce rate. And bounce rate is like
gotcha.
the one thing you want to be super careful with these days. Deliverability is kind of a jungle more so than ever. And like
Mm,
everybody wants the new best provider for this or that, but there's not really anything best. The best we can do is just monitor how the health of our inboxes, and one of the metrics we definitely want to keep down is the bounce rate. Nothing hurts the deliverability as much as having a very high bounce rate.
gotcha, gotcha. And I'm glad you're touching base a bit about like bounce rate too, because what do you think is like a good percentage of bounce rate that you should be looking out for?
Yeah, so what we have seen, and the metric or the KPI we're looking at is 2%, 2 to 3%, but really 2% when it comes down to it. Anything above 3% is when you can start seeing really odd stuff going on. Like we have tried anything from things simply not being delivered, or it seemingly is being delivered, but it's not in reality, till like it
Mm,
will entirely skip the first email in our sequence and go straight to follow ups for no reason.
mm,
So some funky stuff can start happening. Um, can start happening above 3%. A
yeah.
little caveat to that though is that you want to use at least like a couple of hundred up to, I want to say, a minimum of 500 unique leads before you actually start looking at the bounce rate data, because obviously if you send 10
Mm,
emails and you get one bounce, you have a 10% bounce rate. That's not really a
yeah,
reflection of if it's good or bad, because the data
that's
is
good.
so. So KPI for that is 500 unique leads, and then we start really looking at it.
And that's a really good point. Yeah, I mean, okay, so I want to talk a bit about just like lead scraping, right? Because here's what I think most people do when it comes to like scraping a lead list, right? They get the ICP. So the two most, I guess, like resources that they go to is like number one, Crunchbase, and number two,
Mhm.
Apollo. They put in some filter and then they just scrape it and then they just launch that campaign, right? Now, the issue that I'm seeing is most people do that. So these leads are essentially getting targeted like almost every single day. So, what have been like some creative ways that you found to scrape a lead list that are not directly on Apollo or Crunchbase?
Actually, the very first campaign I ever ran was, it's a bit more than 3 years ago at this point, was actually a custom scraped list I used because Finland just happened to have a very good startup directory somewhere on the internet. So I scraped the whole thing,
Mm,
and it absolutely ripped. And it was purely because the list was so well targeted. But we
mm,
have scraped anything from like local directories to maps to school groups, and like anything that is publicly available, we have scraped it there. And so I think a common fear that people have when sourcing lists and just lead sourcing in general is that they're kind of afraid to narrow down on an ICP because they
mm,
think it will shrink the market too much, which on one side is correct, but then on the other side is like you can have 10,000 people in your market to reach out to, and then you can narrow it down to the creme de la creme. Let's say it's
mm,
3,000. You can easily see a 10x
mm.
traction from the more dialed in ICP, just because you're able to speak
Yeah.
so much more directly to them.
Yeah. I mean, I love that. And one things I tell a lot of my clients too is that you gotta narrow down your ICP list, right? Because let's say you run out of lead lists, you can always retarget like 2, 3 months later, right? Like no one's gonna remember a cold email if they don't respond to you. No one's gonna remember in like let's say weeks even, right? Let alone months. So 2, 3 months down the road, you can always just re-upload the lead list, clean it up, and then just retarget again, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. So let's talk a bit about like personalization when it comes to data. How do you keep your cold email like personal? right? Like using data, like what data point do you usually use to kind of personalize it?
So we have went through like ups and downs when it comes to personalization. When I first got into clay, it was like
Mm,
if I can mention what they probably eat for breakfast, that would be ideal. Like anything on a person level that is kind of odd but still cool to say, I would do.
yeah.
Nowadays, we actually don't do any of that anymore. We have entirely removed personalization from our vocabulary, and everything is just a matter of like, is
Mm,
it relevant for us to say?
it's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
so we could say something about some recent news about they acquired a company or whatever it may be that recently happened for them, but then we
Mm,
would use it as like a growth stage indicator and to say something that would be relevant for the offer. We would never do
mm,
sort of personalization just for the sake of personalizing it. So like
I love that.
you will never see me do like mention somebody where they graduated from high school or something like that. I think it's just kind of phony and kind of cringe. And I think
Yeah.
sometimes it kind of has the opposite effect of what people are hoping to achieve with it. You will get some happy replies, but it's not going to be like anything that would ever convert.
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you on that. Like, I still get cold email today that people are saying like, "Hey, Wesley, something about the university that I went to, yada yada yada," and then they pitch me about how I could grow my SaaS, and then I tell them, "Look, buddy, like I don't have a SaaS. I don't know how to break it to you, bro, but you got it all wrong." So yeah, 100% with you on that. Most people like they got too caught up on like the irrelevant personalization, right?
Yeah,
Especially with the people who are on like they don't know so much about code email. They think it's cool and stuff. But yeah, so if you are watching this and you're just starting out with code email, skip all the jargons like the university that your prospect went to and just focus more on like the pain point and the offer that you can give to them, right? Make sure you have the right targeting and then the rest will follow. Well, I think we are coming up on an end, but I do have one last question that I want to ask you. And I ask this to all my interviewees too. Give me one example of the most successful cold email campaign that you have either launched for yourself or your clients in the past, and why did it success?
the most successful. There's a couple of ways to interpret that, like on a campaign
However
level,
you want
or
to
like
interpret it.
a let's say an output level on the back end.
Maybe in a creative way, or maybe you get a lot of like positive responses from it.
So I want to say like it might not be the most successful one, but it definitely was successful and it was very fun and it gave great introduction. So we went to this one startup event where we would pretty much we would scrape the entire list of everyone attending and we would hard ram them the day before, just to get our faces in front of them and tell them what we were going to come to the event with, which was essentially a
Mm,
clay table we had built where all they had to do was scan a QR code, input their website from the company they're working at, and then we would, about 27 seconds later, send them an email they could be sending to their ideal customers. So it would do all of the enrichment,
mm,
all of the ICP profiling, and do the messaging, and we sort of introduced us and that to everyone before we went to the event, and we made it super lighthearted, like if you see us, tap us on the shoulder and we'll get you a tequila shot. And we did buy a bunch of tequila shots
mm.
to people that recognized us from the email, and ultimately ended up converting about, I think, two of the companies that actually met us there
Wow.
and recognized the email. So that was a great introduction, and definitely something we'll be doing again.
That's awesome. And I mean, I just love the fact that you're leveraging cold email, like not just to sell to like leads and things like that, or not to like for lead generation, but you're using it as like a way to get an introduction for the next day event. That's super creative and I love that. So that is pretty much the end of the interview. Emil, thank you so much for your time and hopping into this call with me today. If you are watching this video and you would like to work with Emil, I'll link some sort of like his information down below. You can feel free to contact him to get more accurate on like pricing and things like that. Yeah, thank you so much again for hopping to this interview call with me today.
Thanks for having me, mate.
Yep, have a good one. Bye.